Today's message is going to be quite raw because it's been that kind of a week. We've experienced spiritual warfare in this church in the last 4 years. But this week, once again, it seems like it's reared its ugly head. And it seems like the enemy is trying to advance against the church. And I know that because I walk with you. And I know that because, my own family has experienced that this week. It's crazy how, by God's grace, we haven't been sick at all this year. And then Friday, Mila gets a throat infection. It seems like Judah has that this morning as well. But the reason why this morning is heavy for me is because I got a message as I was setting up this morning here that my cousin just passed away. And the sadness that I feel in my heart is that I don't think he knew Jesus. You see, where I'm from, the people you grow up with, your cousins, they are like your siblings. And I don't know much about the details. I just saw the message just now. And it's quite apt how this actually speaks into the message today as we look at the last sign. But the reason why I feel heavy is because even if you look at today's text, when you look at the God who actually defeated our final enemy, I don't understand why we seem to lay down. I don't understand why we can't get up and continue fighting, because Jesus is going to advance this kingdom. I've had to preach under duress before. Had to preach just before my wife went into major surgery. I've had to preach at my dad's own funeral. That was probably the hardest message I've had to preach. But today is heavy because I'm in grief at the moment. I just got the news like an hour before. But I can just hear the Spirit whisper into my soul that now is actually not the time to lie down. Right? Now is the time to actually look at a God who conquered our final enemy. Now is the time for the church to come together. I mean, this morning it was so beautiful that Daryl wrapped his arms around me and just held me. And both him and Amanda were praying for me. It was so beautiful that Storm gave me the typical Storm hug. I don't know if any of you men have experienced that. But the thing is, this is what the church is for, right? This declares the power of God, that someone who's grieving can stand in front of you and still declare the praises of Jesus. And I hope that you've been at Pulse for a long time, have seen that we haven't backed down, friends. Despite everything that's been thrown at us in this church, we've not backed down, and God has been faithful. And so even though I'm standing here and I'm grieving and I'm weeping, and I'm sure I'll be doing a lot of that later on, I'm still here. I'm still here because Jesus is going to speak through me. And so thank you for being the church this morning. Thank you for ministering to me in my moments of grief. And most of you are finding this out now. Even my wife doesn't know about it. And I find myself delving into a little bit of regret. So what if I'd shared the gospel more with him? Perhaps that would have made a difference. Then I find myself getting a little bit angry because I look at what we have as a church. I look at what the church in the West has. So much preaching, so much love, and yet so many of us still make decisions that keep walking away from God. And yet my cousin, who didn't have any of that, didn't get an opportunity. But I can't live in what ifs. I can't live in regrets. Because when you live in what ifs, it actually cripples your present. And it stifles your future. And so that's the first thing I want to say this morning, even as before we go into the text. Stop living in regret. I know most of you had a hard life, okay? But stop living in regrets, because it is robbing you of the joy you can experience in Jesus. And it's robbing you from the future that God has for you. We're going to look at a text today where someone comes to Jesus and said, if only. And so many of us live like Oh, if only, if only, if only. You know, I was thinking that this morning. If only I had shared the gospel with more fervor as my cousin. He's so young. He's just a few years younger than me. But you can't live with onlys, if onlys. And that's the text here today we'll be looking at. So turn with me to John chapter 11, 21 to 22. Man. Martha said to Jesus, if only, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask. You see, that word ask betrays what is in Martha's heart, because in the original language, that word ask is almost like not asking God, because up to that point they weren't even sure he was the Son of God. Up until that point they saw him as a prophet, as a miracle working prophet, because he'd done all of these things. You see, when we ask, often it's not so much what we ask for, but who we are asking to. Because up until this point, Martha was not quite sure who she was asking. And I wonder why sometimes when we ask, we doubt. And I think we doubt because we're actually not sure who we are asking from. And James 1 verse 6 says, and when you ask, don't ask like someone who doubts, because you are wavering and God does not answer those kind of prayers because you don't know who you're asking from. And I think sometimes we get so over-familiar with Jesus that we don't actually recognize that He is the God of the universe, that He is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, that He holds everything in the palm of His hands. And He can do things that you can never even dream or imagine. So maybe when you ask, perhaps look at your own heart and understand who you are asking, who you are approaching this morning. Because when Martha was saying ask, she wasn't thinking in her mind that He is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, that He is the God of life and death. And so Jesus speaks to a grieving Martha, and then in verse 22 Jesus told her, your brother will rise again. And yes, Martha said, he will rise when everyone else rises on the last day. You know, it's ironical in my life that often when I'm preaching a specific topic, like that very thing that I'm preaching about happens that week. But for it to happen just before I go on stage is like next level. So Holy Spirit, like you're up to something, you know. But Jesus says to her, your brother will rise again. But she does not take it as a word of comfort. You know why? Because think about when you've lost a loved one, right? And especially Christians come to you and they go, you'll see your loved one again. You're going to see your parents again. You're going to see your brother or sister again. I don't know about you, but I haven't found those kind of statements comforting. You know why? Because it's so far removed. It's like it may be decades till I see my parents again. You know? And so Martha is interpreting it like that. Jesus says, you know, your brother will rise again. And she's like, yeah, I know he's going to rise again on that last day. And so and so sometimes those pithy statements that we use is actually not very helpful to people who are grieving in the moment. Yeah, you're going to see them again one day. It's okay. It's not helpful. It's not helpful at all. And that's how she's interpreting it, because she actually doesn't know what Jesus is trying to say. Because Jesus was actually setting her up. Right? He was setting her up, because in verse 25 he says, I am the resurrection and the life, and anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. And everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never die. do you believe this, Martha? He's asking her, do you believe this? Because he makes such an astounding claim. He's almost saying that someone who believes in Jesus, the biggest thing that has an issue in our lives, which is death, it actually no longer becomes an issue. Because just know what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying that those who believe in me and will live with me will what? Will never die. This is profound. Think about it. We're all going to die one day, right? So what does Jesus mean when he says those who believe in me and who live with me will never, never die? You see, you can live fully alive even before physical death. And this, for me, is what grieves me the most about us Christians, is that we eventually come to Christ and we have this high, maybe for a few weeks, or for a few months, maybe even a few years. But then as you walk along in our journey with Jesus, things start to taper down all of a sudden. It's instead of our life, instead of the life of God being more and more increasingly manifested in us, it starts to taper down, and you're like, well, life is tough, so I'm just going to calm down and just wait for the day I die, because then I'm going to live fully alive. And Jesus is saying here, what? Those who believe me and live in me will never die. For you as a Christian, for me as a Christian, death is not awaiting you. You know why? It's already behind you. It's already behind you. Paul says in Galatians 2:20, I have been crucified with Christ. He says that I died with Jesus when Jesus died on that cross. It's behind you. Whew. Just let that sink in for a moment. We'll see in a moment that there is this underlying fear of death that pervades the stream of consciousness of most human beings, and sadly with Christians as well. What Jesus is saying is so profound. He's taken care of death in such a way that it should not stop us from living fully alive. See, that's what Jesus is trying to insist here, and he came to change our paradigm of life and death. Jesus came to change that paradigm. So if the way you think about life and death is still the same after being a Christian, then we actually don't believe that Jesus even has power over death. The paradigm should change. One of my theological influences over the years has been a guy by the name of Tim Keller. And he was amazing. I mean, he did so many incredible things. And he died recently from pancreatic cancer. And he was faithful till the very end, and after his wife said goodbye to him, and he finally said, now I'm ready to see Jesus. But what was a little bit sad for me was that, when he got the cancer diagnosis and they said to him, look, you don't have much longer to live because, it's pancreatic cancer and that tends to be fatal. And he was saying that after that diagnosis, when he knew his death was approaching, that all of a sudden everything was more sweeter. The food was more enjoyable. His long walks with his wife was more enjoyable. It was almost like you could hear the birds sing and everything come to life. And that made me so sad, because I thought, Tim, it had waited this long for you to experience that. You waited this long for you to experience the life that Jesus can give us. Should it be like that for us now, even as we're walking with Jesus? Should it be like that for us now? That food tastes good, that fellowship is amazing, that we're enjoying the trees and the mountains and the birds and the sun, that we're enjoying this life? What is it about us that we only think that life is only possible after we die? You see, Jesus says something that's so profound. He says, those who believe in me and live in me. See, so many of us, we only believe in Jesus, but we almost choose to live a life semi-independent of Him. See, that's what happens. It's like, yes, Lord, I believe that you're a Messiah, I believe that you're the Son of God, I believe that you walked out of the grave, but I'm not going to live in you. I'm going to have one foot in you, Jesus, and I'm going to rely on everything else around me. No wonder we're not experiencing resurrection life. No wonder when you look at our own souls, it looks like we're busy dying instead of us busy living. You see, Mike mentioned that church in the book of Acts. That was compelling to the world. You know why? Because they were living. Because they were selling their homes and their cars and whatever else to provide for those who did not have. They were living because they were unstoppable. Because if the God who they worshiped walked out of the grave, that means they were unstoppable. Neither persecution nor death nor disease. Nothing can stop the church if you're able to grapple with this truth. If this truth sinks in your heart, even death cannot stop you. And that's why I stand here before you this morning, friends, that even the death of someone who's close to me cannot stop me here from preaching, because I was so tempted for a brief second and say, guys, I can't do this morning. Living fully alive. That's what it's about. It's because you're not believing and living in Jesus. And living in Jesus. See, because you live in Jesus, all mental constraints are taken down. Your life becomes a life of endless possibilities. Now you can actually believe in the impossible, because our God is a God of the impossible. It means that you've got to step out of the boat, like we saw Peter do a few weeks ago. Right? And so many of us have these mental constraints in our minds because it's not yet sunk deep into our hearts that Jesus Christ walked out of the grave. That He's defeated our greatest enemy. You see, your faith grows over time the more you do challenging things. And I was just saying to Chris recently, in fact a couple of days ago, I said to her, man, we've done a couple of hard things in the last few years. We've planted a church that in the midst of COVID and everything, and it had seasons where it's been struggling, and now God is slowly bringing this church to life. In the midst of all the challenges, I managed to publish a book as well. You know what I'm feeling now? I said to Chris, there is no limits to what we can do. There is no limits. Now I'm looking at my next 20 and 30 years and 40 years. If God gives me that long, I'm planning stuff. I'm thinking about stuff, and some of it, hopefully over time, will unravel, because if you listen to it now, you think I'm off my rock. But actually, there is no limits once you start actually walking by faith and seeing what God can do. And Martha has not yet grasped that, because Jesus is setting her up. He's setting her up, right? And then in verse 32, when Mary arrived and saw Jesus, this is now the other sister, she fell at His feet and says, Lord, if only, once again, her sister Martha's sister Mary, same thing, if only you'd been there, my brother would not have died. In other words, you've healed so many people from their sickness, if only you'd been there, you'd have healed my brother's sickness as well. If only. And Jesus saw her weeping and saw the other people wailing with her, a deep anger welled up inside him, or within him, and he was deeply troubled. He was deeply troubled. You know what that word means? Deeply troubled. It literally means he was enraged in spirit. Right? Not at the people. Jesus was not enraged at the people. He was enraged at death. Jesus was so full of rage. Literally, this translation literally means, you know, like a horse when it's ready for battle and it snorts, right? And its feet digs in because it's ready to charge into battle. This is Jesus. He's deeply troubled by the fact that death is actually doing this to His people. And that's kind of what I felt this morning. I was deeply enraged by the fact that death had stolen from me someone I loved. But then Jesus keeps reminding me this morning that it doesn't keep you down. You see, he was deeply troubled that this is what death was doing to his people. Deeply, deeply troubled. He's stirred up, because I want to tell you something, that Jesus hates death more than you do, friends. That's why he came into this world. You see, when death entered into this world through man's disobedience against God, God is not a passive God. God is not a God who sits back and goes, oh well, you've made your bed, so lie in it. He does something about it. And Jesus here is enraged at death, and there's one of those songs, right? He is our champion, right? He fights for us against our greatest enemy. See, that's what Christians should be like. Enraged by the things in this world that rob people of life. And we get up and we fight like Jesus fights. Because he stares death in the face. And what he's going to do with Lazarus is the precursor of his resurrection. But he stares death in the face. And he's going, I'm coming. You better watch out, man. And that's why I entitled this sermon, Death is Buried. Death is buried, because nothing should stop those who actually follow Jesus, not even death. He is deeply troubled by this. He hates death. And in the next verse, the most famous, shortest verse in the scriptures, that Jesus wept. And Jesus wept because he's not only angry at death, but he's also grieved by it. He's grieved for what it does to people, because Jesus loves people. He's grieved at what death does to people, and he's angry at death. You see, that word wept doesn't mean wailing out loud. You hear some people, when a loved one passes, they're wailing so loud you can hear them from a long ways away. But here that word doesn't mean wailing, it means sobbing. When it comes from deep inside you and tears come out of your eyes, that's what Jesus is doing. And it's a combination of being deeply troubled and grieved that gets him up for the fight. It's a combination of being deeply troubled and grieved that gets him out of the fight. And I think often in our lives, friends, you're not grieved by your situation enough. I can tell you that. You're not grieved by the state of South Africa enough. You're not grieved by the state of your neighborhood enough. You're not grieved by the state of your work colleagues enough. You don't believe that Jesus can bring dead things to life. You don't, and perhaps that's why we're not willing to fight. We're not willing to fight. When even Isaiah 53 says, he was a man of sorrows, acquainted with deepest grief. And this is one of the beautiful signs for me, is that our God is not so far removed from your pain, friends. This God ministered to me this morning in such a profound way, and that's why I'm able to stand before you here this morning. Literally, he is so acquainted with our grief that actually is what encourages and empowers us to carry on. He's not aloof from your grief. He's not aloof from your troubles. That's why we could stand here this morning and praise the Lord. That's one of the most beautiful signs. Sure. Then he utters those famous words. He says, Lazarus, come out, in verse 43. Lazarus, come out. It says Jesus shouted, Lazarus, come out. I love what some commentators say. They say this. It's good that Jesus mentioned the name Lazarus, because if Jesus had just said, come out, like all the people in the graves would have come out, right? If he had just said, come out, then everyone would have walked out. But he said specifically, Lazarus. You know what a voice is? A voice is sound coming out of your mouth, right? It's sound waves coming at various frequencies that travel through space. That's what a voice is. You know how powerful the voice of God is? That sound waves travel from God's voice and it brings to life things that are dead. This is what Jesus is doing. Just Lazarus come out and it energizes a dead body and it calls Lazarus' spirit to return back into his body and he comes out. That's the power of God's voice. You know, the first time that we read the scriptures of God's voice is those famous 4 words in Genesis 1. Let there be light. You see, when God said that, there was an explosion of energy into the universe. Because light is actually one of the most purest forms of energy, right? And guess what they've discovered recently? Is that the universe is still expanding. The universe is still growing, and when God brings something to life and He puts it in motion, it continues to grow. That's the power of our God. And so I want to ask you this morning, that's what Jesus is saying to you. Perhaps that's why He's brought you here today and He's calling out your name. Perhaps He's saying, Sylvester, come out. Come out of your self-pity. Come out of self-loathing. Come out of having such a diminished view of who you are. Come out of having such a diminished view of God. Come out. Can you hear those words? Personalize it and make it your name. Insert your name into that. You see, who we are and how we carry ourselves actually is magnetic and attractive to people. Mike was just talking about that, about the early church community. And perhaps we've been carrying ourselves in a way that doesn't reflect that actually the life of Jesus is in us. And Jesus is calling out our names, saying, coming out. Come out. You see, ever since we decided, when God showed us that our church should be about living fully alive, I've been on that journey of discovering what it means to live fully alive. And it's required deep soul work. But you know what's amazing? Like I said to Chris, I can't recognize myself anymore. I'm not the same guy who I was 4 years ago. I'm not the same guy who I was 2 years ago. I'm not the same guy who I was a year and a half ago. Man, I'm not even the same guy who I was 8 or 9 months ago. Because of the life of Jesus bubbling underneath the surface. See, that's what Jesus said to the Samaritan woman. Rivers of living water will what? Flow out from you. See, the last sign of Jesus communicates to us that He has the power over our final enemy. You see, you may never hear God's voice. You may have heard God's voice. You know, some people think that God doesn't speak to them audibly. And so you may never have heard God's voice. But I can tell you one thing, friends. You've seen God's voice. It's all around you. Did He not speak creation into existence? When you look up at the stars, you're seeing God's voice because He spoke that into existence. So we have no excuse as Christians. I've not heard God's voice. Yes, you may not have heard God's voice, but you have seen His voice. And He calls dead things to life because the sound waves that travel from His mouth energizes dead things and brings them to life. And so I want to ask you today, what is dead in your soul? I'm looking at you with my eyes. I'm asking you, what is something in your life that is dead? That you believe cannot be resurrected? Because I'm actually tired of Christians playing the pity party. I'm actually tired of Christians almost living like they've not had an encounter with this Jesus. Man, one day I'll sit down with you and share with you some of the things that has happened in the last 4.5 years, I can promise you, Jesus is well and truly alive in my life, in the life of my family, in the life of this church. What about you needs to be resurrected? Because for me, for so long in my life, what needed to be resurrected was how I saw myself. Because for so long in my life, the way I saw myself as someone of no worth and not much value, and not much worth, and so I was craving for acceptance, craving for significance, right? And that's no way to live, friends. That's no way to live. And no wonder just who I am, like the life of Jesus was not coming out of me. Like I was being a Christian, right? I was doing Christianity. But the life and the light and the love of Jesus was not evident in me. I just read yesterday morning from the Proverbs that the life of the godly are what? Full of light and full of joy. And that just resonated and reverberated in my spirit as I read it yesterday morning. The life of the godly are what? Full of joy and full of light. Man, I wonder if that's what people say about us. And so, I'm going to walk out of these doors this morning just exactly that. Yes, I'm going to go home and probably grieve some more about the death of my cousin. But I am full of life this morning. Because I'm not defined by my trials, I'm not defined by my temptations, I'm not defined by what's in the bank account or what's not in the bank account. And so that's the kind of church I'm interested in leading, friends, like, to be honest. And I think this church has been a church of love. This church has been a church of compassion. But I think sometimes the church also needs a little bit of stirring up. Because next time you're in a counseling session with me, and we have lots of those, you may just find me stirring you up a little bit. Because it's time to stop playing pity party games. It's time to start roaring like the Lion of Judah. It's time to start walking in the authority that Christ has given you. It's time to walk in the plan and the purposes that God has ordained for you in your life. Because your final enemy has been conquered, man. If that has been conquered, what is stopping you? Like, what really is stopping you? Jesus is calling you. You see, in Ephesians chapter 2, right? Paul says to the church, he says, you who were what? Dead in your sins, what? Have been made alive, right? But here's the difference. There's a difference between being made alive and living fully alive. Big, big difference, friends. So many of us have been made alive by Christ, but we're not living fully alive because we only believe in Jesus. We're not living in Jesus. So I ask you again, what about you makes... Whew. Wow. What about you needs to be resurrected is what I'm asking this morning. Can you hear the voice of Jesus that says, Lazarus come out, Storm come out, Amanda come out, Vase come out, Kathy come out, Brad come out, Larico come out, Jason come out, Astrid come out, Gradell come out, Helen come out, Jane come out, Bianca come out, Mike come out, Sharon come out. It's time to stop living in the tomb. It's time to come out and live. Patrick, come on. I don't miss you there, but I know you're on the side.
I was wondering.
Now you're on the side.
He's not come.
And finally, Sasha, come out. Let me pray for this.